All right, 1 o'clock here in North Carolina. So it's time for our weekly Aesop studies. So let's get settled in here. We're going to pick up with Aesop's Fables. Let's see. Oh, I wanted to say one thing about Aesop's Fables. Last night, I was watching a video about our government, and as I was watching the video, it was a very complicated discussion about our government and money and economics and all this stuff. And in the middle of this video, this discussion, one of the men who's in charge, or who was in charge of a government office that deals with all the money in the banks and stuff like that, he was asked a question and he had to explain a complicated idea, and he chose to do so by using one of Aesop's fables. So I thought it was pretty interesting, because we always talk about how to apply Aesop's fables, and it was pretty neat to see a man working in government who, in order to understand what's going on in the government and money and the banks and all this complicated stuff, you could see that he was able to understand it by thinking about one of Aesop's fables. I actually posted a clip from that video on the student forum on the Aesop's Fables course page. So if you want to see that, I mean, it's not the most exciting thing in the world. It's about government and economics and stuff like that. But if you want to see how a really intelligent person in a very important position makes use of Aesop's fables, it's a good example of why we study them and how we apply them and use them to understand complicated things in life. So if you go to the Aesop's Fables course page and go to the student forum on the course page, you'll see last night, or early this morning, actually, I posted a link to a video on applying Aesop's fables in modern life. So if you want to check that out, you can check that out there on the student forum. All right. Looks like everybody's settling in here. We still got a few kids coming in, so hopefully they can make it in. This week in Aesop's Fables, we're going to study the fable of the dog in the manger. The dog in the manger. All right, the dog in the manger. That's our fable, and I'm going to share my screen here so you can see this nasty dog in the manger. So we've got this picture in our book that's given to us, and we see a nasty old dog growling and barking at the ox here in the picture. Again, we've got a couple kids still coming in, so let's just make sure they get in okay. All right, so the ox, no, sorry, not the ox, the dog in the manger. And before we get started with this, last week I said that Damien can read. So Damien, if you're anxious about that, I didn't forget. I said you could read this week. Hopefully you've got your microphone figured out. So we'll get there in a minute. But the dog in the manger. And before we read this, let me just make a few notes to clear things up here. A manger, we talk about the manger, and unfortunately for Catholics, we often think of the nativity scene at Christmas time. We think of the little house and the wise men and the Holy Family in the house, and sometimes we just call that the manger. We say that's the manger, but that's not the manger. The manger is the box that the baby Jesus was laid in. The box was the manger. And what a manger is, if you don't know this, if you do know this, don't roll your eyes at me. Not everybody knows this, but if you don't know what the manger is, it's the feed box. It's the box where the farmer would put feed for the animals. It's the box they eat out of. It's their food tray. Okay. But usually, because we're talking about farm animals, it's not like a little cat bowl or a dog bowl. It's usually a big box that they fill with hay or they fill with grain and things like that. That's what a manger is, because the word manger comes from the word which means to eat. So the dog in this fable is laying in the feed box or the feed tray. That's what the title of this fable means. Just make sure when we say manger, we're talking about the feed box. Not the house where the Holy Family was at Christmas. And when we say that Jesus was laid in a manger, we mean that he was laid in a feed box. So usually the feed box is kept pretty clean. you can put some hay or straw in it to make it comfortable. And so the Virgin Mary took the child Jesus when he was born, wrapped him up, and laid him in this feed box that was filled with hay and made to be like a little bed. That's the idea of the manger. So here we have the fable of the dog in the manger. So Damien, are you interested in reading here today? Let me find you. I'll give Damien a chance, and if he has technical difficulty again, we'll give it to somebody else. So see if you can unmute yourself, Damien.
Am I on mute?
There you go. Sounds good. So so you're going to read this fable for us today, and just take your
Okay.
time. The goal is to read it clearly, okay? So read it nice and slow and clearly, and then we'll talk about it. Go ahead.
The dog in the manger. A dog was lying in a manger full of hay. An ox, being hungry, came near and was going to eat of the hay. The dog, getting up and snarling at him, would not let him touch it. Surly creature, said the ox. You cannot eat the hay yourself, and yet you will let no one else have any.
Very good. Thank you. So that was great. So we've got the fable of the dog in the manger. So now this is a very short fable. And we look at this and we say, oh, okay, so this is a nice short one. We should get done with this in just a few minutes. But no, this is a very, very important fable that has a very complex and important message. So we might need the whole class today just to talk about this one fable. And we're going to go through it in detail. And like I always say, it doesn't matter what fable you're working on in your normal study through Aesop's Fables. You could be getting started with just the first lesson, or you could be on lesson, 200, whatever. We're going to go through these fables together. And then what I recommend you do, especially if you've never done the fable before, after we talk about it and go through all the details, I'll help you to answer all the questions that I ask about the fable. After the class is over, while all of that is still fresh in your head, go finish that lesson. So go find the fable of the dog in the manger. It's around fable number 90, somewhere around there. I don't know the exact number, but go find the fable of the dog in the manger and complete that assignment and submit it while all of the answers and explanations are still fresh in your mind. It's a very easy way for you to get through this Aesop's Fables course without having to do a whole lot of work. All right, so that's that. If anyone can tell us what lesson the dog in the manger is, what number in the course, that'd be good. You can text that. 91. Thank you, Cecilia. Good. All right, so lesson 91. Thank you. So the dog in the manger. So let's take a look at this fable and figure all of this out. So a dog was lying in a manger full of hay. A dog was lying in a manger full of hay. So the first thing that we have to ask, like I said, is what is a manger? What's the purpose of the manger? So we can understand what's going on here. The manger is full of hay. The manger is the box that the animals in the barn eat out of. It's full of hay. Well, where did that hay come from? That hay came from the farmer. The farmer put the hay in the manger. He filled the hay. And why did, you can answer this for me if you'd like, why did the farmer fill the manger with hay? Why did he fill the manger with hay? Go ahead, quick answer. To feed the ox, very good. So the purpose of the manger, it's the ox's feed tray, feed trough, it's called. And it's full of hay because the farmer filled the manger with hay to feed the ox. And yet here we find a dog lying in the manger full of hay. Now, let's assume that that's the farmer's dog. It could be a wild dog, we're not told, but let's assume that this is just the farmer's dog. He normally is in and out of the barn. But the dog finds this manger full of hay. And just so you know the difference, again, I know you may not know much about farm life, but sometimes when people think about hay, they think about straw. If you think about the scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz, he was full of straw, not hay. And the oxen, he's not eating straw, which is from the stems of wheat plants. He's eating hay, which is just grass that's been cut. So think about when you cut the grass. If you cut the grass and you you bag it up, in the lawnmower, you've got this bag full of grass. It's soft. On farms, what they do is they let the grass grow tall, so it's like 2 feet tall, and then they cut it. And in the old days, in the times of Aesop, they didn't put it into bales, or they just used to scoop it up onto a tractor. Well, not even on a tractor, on some kind of wagon. They would just scoop it up in big piles, all of this long cut grass. They'd scoop it up, throw it onto a wagon, and then bring it back to the barn and store it all in the barn for the winter. And then they would feed the animals from all of this saved grass that they cut during the year. So hay is dried out grass. It's soft like grass. Don't think about straw, think about hay. So obviously, if the dog was looking for a place to lay, he would be wandering around and he would find this manger full of this soft grass. And he would say, oh, there's a great place to lay down. So he'd hop into the manger where all the hay was, and he used it as a bed. Animals like to do this, especially when it's cold, when the ground is cold. That's usually when animals are eating hay anyway, because in the summertime, they're out in the fields. But it's usually the ground is cold, the dog's looking for a warm, soft place to lay, or it's wet and he's looking for a dry place to lay. So he finds this manger full of hay. They cut it by hand. They used a tool called a scythe, which is just like a big long knife that they use to cut all the grass down. And then they would just use pitchforks to throw it into piles, let it dry out, and then throw it onto a wagon and bring it back to the barn. They'd have to cut the whole field by hand with a scythe. It's just like a rake that's got a big blade on it. So imagine how hard that work was, but that's how it was done. All right, so they bring this hay back to the barn, they store it in the barn for the winter, and then they feed the animals out of the hay over the winter. Well, this dog says, boy, that hay manger looks like a nice, comfortable place to lay down. So the dog hops up into the manger and lays down on this bed of hay. Well, the ox comes along. It says an ox, being hungry, came near and was going to eat of the hay. The dog, getting up and snarling at him, that means growling, and when dogs make that ugly, nasty face and they show their teeth, that's snarling. So the dog, getting up and snarling at the ox, would not let him touch the hay because that was his comfortable bed. And so the ox says to the dog, you surly creature, you cannot eat the hay yourself, and yet you will let no one else have any. And this is the fable of the dog in the manger. So we've got to figure out what this fable teaches us, okay? And like I said, it's a short fable, but it's got a lot of important wisdom and instruction in it. So let's get into it. Now, before we get into it, we've got this word surly, which I think is a word that you probably don't know the meaning of, this word surly. Okay? What is the word? Now, what we do, I've told you this before, if we're reading something and we come across a word that we don't know the meaning of, we have to try to figure out what the meaning is based on what's written. Okay, so we're not going to go grab a dictionary and look it up. We don't need to do that. You need to learn to figure out the meanings of words from their context when you read them, because you're not going to always have a dictionary available. So we're reading along through this fable, and we come to this word surly. Now, the first thing that I want you to do is when you find a word you don't know, don't just say, oh, I don't know what that means. That's just lazy, right? That's lazy. We can figure out what we need to know about this word from what we read. And the first question you should ask is this. The ox says to the dog, surly creature. Do you think surly is a positive thing or a negative thing? You think surly is good or bad? Negative, good, okay? So you can see that based on the context, based on what we read, we might not know what surly means, but we can easily see that it's not something good, right? The ox says surly creature, and that doesn't mean good creature. That doesn't mean, oh, nice little doggy. That's not what he's saying. This dog is snarling and growling at the ox, And the ox refers to him as surly creature. So I want you to see that when you're reading and you come across words you don't know, sometimes you don't even need to know the exact meaning of the word. You simply need to know if it's good or bad. That's the first thing that you should think about. Is it a good thing to be called surly or a bad thing to be called surly? And we're going to say that based on what we read, it's a bad thing. If you were going to guess what the word surly means, if you were going to guess what exactly the word surly means, based on this story, based on the fable, what do you think the word surly means? Let's try to be a little more detailed than just saying bad or negative. What do you think? Greedy. I see Damien wrote greedy. We have rude, greedy, not nice, ridiculous, rude and silly, wicked. Good. Okay, those are good guesses. What it means, if you actually do look it up in the dictionary, it means unfriendly. Okay, so he basically calls him a nasty thing. You nasty thing, you, right? You surly creature. That's the idea. Evil, that's fine. Good. Okay. So the ox criticizes the dog as being nasty thing. You nasty thing, you, right? And then notice what the ox says. You cannot eat the hay yourself. You can't even eat the hay. And so I saw, the Hazelbarths, you said ridiculous. You can see here that the dog does act in a ridiculous way, right? How ridiculous. I'm coming to eat the hay. You can't even eat the hay, he says. You cannot eat the hay yourself, and yet you will let no one else have any. So he is being ridiculous, unfriendly, nasty thing. Okay. So that's the ox's argument. So we get an idea of what the fable says, what the story tells us. But now let's talk about the real moral of this fable. Let's start by looking at the dog. Okay. Where does the dog get his food from? Answer that question for me. Where does the dog get his food from? Dog wakes up, is hungry, comes in, is hungry. Where does he get his food from? Yeah, he gets his food from the farmer. Good. Okay, so the dog gets his food from the farmer. What does the dog get fed? Think about a dog on a farm. They don't necessarily go to the grocery store and buy some, Alpo or some, prepared dog food. What do you think the dog gets fed? Bones, meat, scrapes, yeah. Scrap from the kitchen, right? Leftovers. The dog is allowed to eat from the leftovers, things like that. So the dog is fed by the people of the farm, by the farmers, and the dog eats meat and things like that. The dog doesn't even eat the same stuff as the ox. So what I want you to keep in mind here is the dog already has his food. The dog already has his food. It's in the house. The ox doesn't have any food. So, and again, remember, in the summertime or in the spring or even in the fall, we usually don't feed the animals hay on a farm because they can go get it out in the field. They can go browse and graze and find grass to eat. We cut the grass in the summertime and we save it because usually during the summer when the grass is growing, the grass grows so much that the animals can't even eat it all. So there's extra. And we cut it and we gather it so it's not wasted, and we put it away for the winter when there's no grass in the field. Imagine if you're living in a state like Wisconsin or Minnesota, where the fields are covered with snow for most of the winter. The cows can't even reach any grass. It's buried under snow. So they completely depend upon hay in the winter months, and farmers have to do the work of preparing the food for the grass-eating animals for the wintertime. So the ox, this hay is all that he has to eat. This is all that he gets, and this is the bulk, the majority of his food. So he goes to his manger to eat. He's hungry. We're told he's hungry, and he goes to the manger, and the dog is laying in the hay, sleeping, not hungry, comfortable, and resting in the hay. Well, there's a couple different problems with this. First of all, the dog is selfish. The dog already has his food, and then he's going around looking where he can make himself comfortable. and he finds the ox's manger full of hay, this soft cut grass, and decides to lay in it and use it as a bed. Well, the problem with that is that that's the ox's only food. And then when the ox comes to eat, the dog jumps up and snaps at him and growls and tries to chase him away, as if the dog actually has a right to this hay, as if the dog has a right to have a bed made out of hay, which he doesn't. So he starts barking and growling at the ox, and the ox kind of yells at him and says, "You surly creature, you can't even eat the hay, and you will let no one else eat any." That's enough with the chat. That's enough with chat. Pay attention. The ox says, "You can't even eat the hay, and now you're going to bark and growl at me and threaten to bite me when, this is my food. It's all I get." And so the ox calls the dog a surly creature and criticizes him. Now, I want you to keep all of these details in your mind. The dog already has his food. The farmer put the hay in the manger for the ox. The ox has no other food. The dog is using this hay for a purpose that it's not intended for. When a farmer prepares a bed for an animal, they don't use hay to make a bed for an animal. They use straw. That's what straw is for, because it's drier. It's not like grass, not soft like grass. They feed the animals hay, which is grass, and they use straw to make beds out of. Well, even if the dog wanted to find some straw, that might have been okay, but the dog goes beyond that. The dog is not even content with finding some straw to lay in. The dog wants to lay in the hay because it's softer than straw. So this dog is a real fat cat. He's looking to live in luxury. He finds the softest bed he can find, not even made out of material that's used for bedding. He's going to lay down in material that's actually necessary for food because it's so soft, and deny the ox access to his own food. So this dog, he's really looking to live a luxurious life here. He's going to make himself a bed out of hay, which is not even what the animals lay in. And that's what's so ridiculous about the dog is, the hay is not for him, first of all. It wasn't put there for him. It's not even what animals do lay in. And yet this dog thinks that he's going to make this his bed. And that's how dogs are. They're crazy. They think that they're the king of every place they go. So the ox criticizes this dog and says, "You cannot eat the hay, and yet you're going to let no one else have any of it." All right. So we've got a good idea of the details of the story and the characters. The ox is just doing what he's supposed to do. This is his food. It was prepared for him by the farmer. He's hungry. He's just coming to get his daily bread. He's just coming to get his food that was prepared for him. He's not doing anything wrong. He's not being selfish. He's not being gluttonous. He's not already full looking for something else. He's coming hungry to the manger looking for his food, and the dog is chasing him away. So that's the fable. Now let's look at the application and think about how this applies to life. What's the real purpose of this fable? Because this is a pretty helpful message, important one for us today. We have to start with the farmer because everything in the story is his. Everything belongs to the farmer, okay? The animals are his. The barn is his. The hay is his. The manger is his. Everything is the farmer's. And so all that matters is what is the farmer's will. That's all that matters. It's all the farmer's stuff. He decides what should be done with it. He prepared this manger and put this hay in the manger. I'll get to the moral in a minute. We have to get a little further into the story. We have to focus on the farmer because everything is his, and he's the only one who has a right to say what should be done in this situation. That hay was put in that manger for that ox. That farmer did not put that hay in the manger for the dog. So the dog is wrong. And he's wrong because he does not do the will of the farmer. The ox is right because he's actually living and acting according to the will of the farmer. The dog is wrong, the ox is right. The farmer's will is what determines who's wrong and who's right in this situation. The dog is in a place he doesn't belong, and the dog knows that if the farmer came in there, he'd chase him out of the manger. The dog's in a place he doesn't belong. The dog's doing his own will. He's only thinking about himself, and he's thinking about how he can make himself as comfortable as possible without thinking about anybody else. So the dog is just living a selfish life, seeking his own comfort, and he doesn't even care what the purpose of things is. All he's thinking about is his own comfort. And he finds this manger filled with this soft hay, and he says, oh, you know what? That would be good for me to lay down in. That'd be a nice bed for me. I don't need any food. I've already eaten in the house. But look at this. This will be a nice bed. And so he uses the ox's food for his bed. So he's not even living according to nature. He's just living a selfish life, thinking about nothing but his own comfort and pleasure. That's the character of the dog in this fable. He's not doing the farmer's will. He's acting contrary to the farmer's will. And he's also not thinking about the need of the ox, his neighbor. This is the ox's food. The dog doesn't care. The dog would rather that the ox starve in the winter than that he not have a comfortable bed. So just think about that. The dog would rather that the ox go hungry with no food rather than give up a comfortable bed made out of the ox's food. That's what the dog is doing here. So the dog in this story is very selfish and wicked. The poor ox can't even get any food. I said before, we usually don't feed animals hay in the summertime, so because there's grass in the field for them to eat. So if the ox is eating hay, it's probably cold weather or bad weather, like it could be raining out or stormy. And also the dog wouldn't necessarily be looking to lay in the hay if it was warm outside. The dog would probably be laying out on the lawn somewhere or under a tree. So there's reasons we can reason that it's probably wintertime or the weather's bad outside, okay? So that's that. The dog is just selfish, looking for its own pleasure and comfort, and it doesn't care about the needs of anybody else. Now, let's get to the moral of the story, okay? Let's get to the moral, and I don't want you chatting unless you're chatting in response to me, okay? Pay attention. The moral of this story, right? The moral, if we look at the dog, is simply to not be selfish, right? We can't live selfishly, but we've got to share, and we've got to think of others. And so we could just say the moral of this fable is the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So the moral is simple, but the application here is really important. That's what I'd like to get into a little bit. In our lives, we live and we go out and we work, and, you're going to grow up and go work. Your parents work, you make money, you go into the world, you go into the world, especially in America, because we have what's called a free market, which means you're allowed to start your own businesses. You're allowed to make your own money. If you're really good at what you do and people people want what you do, you can become wealthy without any sin. You can become wealthy by good, honest, hard work. You can become wealthy, all right? And when people do that, they often feel like they deserve what they get. I worked, it was my business idea, I did all the work, it made tons of money, that money's all mine. And that's how they think. And that seems like it's okay, and it is okay because, think about it. We look at the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments say, you shall not steal, right? So if I go and work and I make a bunch of money and I put that money in my bank account and I buy myself a car and I buy myself a house and I buy myself some clothes and do some other things that I'm happy with, all of that stuff I pay for by working. I'm not stealing. I'm not breaking any laws. I'm not sinning by doing that. I'm working, I'm earning an honest income, and then I use my income to do things that I want to do. That's not sinning. That's what it means to have private property. And the commandment, you shall not steal, shows us that God respects private property. God doesn't believe it's wrong for someone to have private property. God actually protects private property by making it illegal to take it from other people. So we're allowed to have our own private property. We have a right to private property. So keep that in mind. We have a right to private property. There's nothing wrong with that. So if this dog was just minding his own business and he was working and he earned money, bought himself some food, then decided to buy himself some hay and make himself a nice comfortable bed, and he did that all by his own work, all with his own money that he earned honestly, there wouldn't be anything wrong with that. The dog doesn't do that, though, first of all. But that's not the problem. There's another right there's another right that's more important than the right to private property. There's another right that human beings have that's more important than the right to private property. Does anybody know what that right is? What right do human beings have that's more important than the right to private property? The right to life. Good. Okay, very good. The right to life. Now, if a person is starving, and give me a yes or no. How many of you know the story of Les Miserables? How many of you know the story of Les Miserables? Yes or no? No. Okay. Well, in the story Les Miserables, good, that's okay. Okay. In the story Les Miserables, there's a man who's poor and his family has no money, they have no food, and he decides to break into a bakery and steal some bread for his family. And when he breaks into the bakery to steal the bread, he gets caught by the police and he gets thrown into prison. Okay, so we have this moral dilemma of, if you're starving, is it okay to steal? Right? We have this moral question. Or is stealing always wrong, even if you're starving? Is it, if you were starving and the only way you could get something was to take it from somebody else, would it be better to die than to take it? And the answer is no, because the right to life is the right to life is more important than the right to private property, okay? And when people are in a desperate situation like that, first of all, they shouldn't be in a situation like that because their neighbors should be merciful and help them and share. But they're often driven to a decision that they really didn't want to make, but they had to make. And they considered it worth breaking the law to try to get food, especially if you've got children or a wife and children to provide for. So in the story Les Miserables, the main character decides to steal bread for his family, gets caught and is thrown into prison. And we've got this moral question of what's right and wrong. So if a person is stealing to save his own life, he's really not stealing. He's not stealing. He's actually taking what by God's will belongs to him and should be his, but is kept from him by other people. So that's really, technically, that's not stealing. So if we think about the ox and the dog is like a person who has more than he needs. The dog is already fed, and he's so rich at this time that he's actually using the food of other animals to make himself a bed to sleep in. Now think about how luxurious that would be, okay? The food that these other animals need to live, he's actually using that material to sleep in. That's his luxurious life. And so this ox comes along looking for his food. He's got nothing else except for this grass, this hay. He comes looking for this hay, and the dog acts nastily to him. Excuse me. The dog acts and says, "Hey, this is mine. This is my stuff. What are you doing coming here looking to take this grass away from me? This is mine. I was here first. I decided to make this my bed. You get out of here, go find some grass someplace else." The dog is thinking about this idea of his right to have his own stuff, finders keepers. I was here first, and so on. and he thinks to chase the ox away, and he can chase the ox away because he's nasty and he can bite, he can attack and hurt this ox. This ox really isn't an animal that's meant for fighting. So the dog is nasty and chases the ox away, threatening to bite him, growling and snarling at him. So the ox really can't do anything and would have to back off. But the dog is choosing to use what should belong to the ox for his food as this luxurious bed for himself. And so it's an image for us of a rich person gathering together stuff that he doesn't actually need to make his life more luxurious, more comfortable, and denying other people the stuff that they need to live in order to make his life more comfortable. All right. And we have a good Bible story that relates to this fable. And it's the parable that Jesus tells of the rich man and Lazarus, the fable of the rich man and Lazarus. In the fable of the rich man and Lazarus, there's a rich man, and Jesus tells this story. He tells us that there was a rich man who lived in great luxury and ate all kinds of delicious foods every day. He was dressed in the finest clothes, had jewelry and all kinds of expensive goods, lived a luxurious life. And outside of this rich man's house, out in the street in front of his house, there was a homeless man who had nothing. He didn't have a house, he didn't have food, he didn't have any clothes. He was in such bad shape that he had open sores on his body. So he had all these physical problems. It says the dogs in the street were licking his sores. That's how terrible his situation was. And yet, across the lawn inside this house, this rich man and his friends and family lived in luxury, while this other man struggled for his life in the street. And Jesus tells the parable that these two men died. The poor man actually went down into what we could call limbo, I guess. He didn't go to hell. He went down into a place where he was comforted after death. And this was before the church was established. So there wasn't even really heaven and hell yet. He went down into this place called Abraham's bosom, where he was comforted by Abraham because he had suffered so badly during his life. He was comforted after death. The rich man, because he lived luxuriously during his life, he was sent into hell, and he's being burned by flames in hell in this story that Jesus teaches. And the rich man is begging for help. He's begging for water. He actually asks Lazarus, this poor man, after they die, he asks Lazarus if Lazarus will give him some water. And Jesus actually stops. Jesus stops him and says, whoa, no, rich man, you had your good things while you lived, and now you're going to suffer. Lazarus had evil things in life, and he is comforted. So this rich man asks Lazarus for help in the life after death, but the rich man was not willing to help Lazarus while he was alive. So we have this image of the rich man and the poor man, the rich man living a rich life, but he's actually using the stuff that the poor man needs to even live. And that's what's wrong. So Xavier asks a good question. He asks, does this mean that if you live luxuriously, you go to hell? Well, we have to be careful here because that's really not the situation, okay? The problem is that Jesus tells us very plainly, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. And think about what the dog's doing. If the dog is looking for a comfortable place to lay down, there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong for the dog to look for a comfortable place to lay down. So that's not the problem. That's not the problem. So again, what if you're nice and rich? Let's think about this. This is why I said this is an important parable, an important fable, okay? There's nothing wrong with looking for a comfortable place to lay down. Obviously, that's what anyone would do. You would look for a comfortable place to lay down. Go find a shady spot, go find a soft place to lay down. sit next to a creek and put your feet in the water on a summer day, sit next to a fire on a winter day. That's normal. That's what we should do. That's not the problem here in this fable. If you think about the details of the fable, this dog is not just looking for a place to lay down. This dog is taking the food from another animal and using it to make his bed with. You see the difference there, okay? The difference is, it's one thing, like I said, you can work and work honestly and be really smart. You can study hard, work hard, and become successful, and you can earn a lot of money, and it's your right. It's your right because you earned it honestly. But that does not mean that you can, and a good person won't think like that. A good person will say, yes, I worked hard and I earned this money and I had to work. But a good person will also say, the only reason, though, that I'm even able to do this is by the grace of God. God gave me the opportunity. He gave me the ability. He gave me the opportunity. He probably gave me encouragement when I was doing the hard work, when things got really hard. Normally, when people succeed, good people, they're very thankful, and they know that other people and God helped them to be successful, and they look to share. They look to share, okay? So being rich and being greedy are two different things, okay? There are many saints in history who were rich people, but they were very generous. And you can think of examples of rich saints, like Saint Thomas More was a rich man. He was the Chancellor of England. King Louis of France was obviously rich. He was a king. Okay, so there are rich saints, but they were not selfish, and that's the difference. Okay, King Saint Louis, if you ever get a chance to read about his life, King Saint Louis, he was the king of France. So imagine how powerful and wealthy he was as the king of France. He used to invite homeless people to come and eat at his dining room table, to eat with him when he ate his dinner. That's an example of a rich Christian person, right? Generous, humble, thankful, friendly. That's an example of true riches, right? He's rich, but he's very generous. This man in the parable in the gospel, he's not like King St. Louis. He's rich and he's selfish. This dog in the fable is not like King St. Louis. He's living luxuriously, but he's very selfish. And he's living his luxurious life. Here's the key. He's living his luxurious life at the expense of other people. So Jude, you ask, what's the moral? The moral of the fable, and that's right, Elizabeth, I see you wrote St. Francis of Assisi was very rich. That's true. He was very rich and he chose to give it all up. So again, think about those things, okay? Many of the saints came from rich families. I'm a lay Dominican. Saint Dominic was from a very rich family. So there's no problem with riches when we live generously and thankfully. Okay, so it's important to understand that. But the dog was not living like that. Jude says, what's the moral? The moral is you cannot seek comfort at other people's expense. You cannot seek comfort at other people's expense. That's the moral of this fable, okay? It's one thing to seek comfort. You know, if I'm going to buy myself a bed, I'm not going to intentionally look for a bed that's not comfortable, right? That's the whole point of a bed, is to allow me to sleep comfortably. But if I learn that somebody has no food, and let's say I've got $100 or more, whatever, I've got some money and I've got a choice to make. And I learn that my neighbor has no food for his family. And I'm thinking about how I can get rid of my old bed and get a new, more comfortable bed. You can see that decision that needs to be made. Am I going to go get myself a more comfortable bed? Or am I going to think about my neighbor who doesn't even have food and try to help him to have food before I seek my more comfortable bed, right? You see the difference there, okay? So the moral of this fable is we cannot seek comforts at other people's expense. We cannot seek comfort at other people's expense. Okay, that's the moral of this fable. Think about the idea of slavery. Where we have slavery, one family lives a very luxurious, comfortable life, and they do that by making other people live in terrible conditions. They make their life beautiful and comfortable by taking away all comforts from other people. That's what makes certain kinds of slavery evil, because people seek to live luxuriously at the expense of others, and they break the golden rule, which is what ultimately we're dealing with here. So the moral of this fable is you cannot seek comfort at other people's expense, because God filled the world with good things, and God fills the world with good things to be enjoyed by all people. He intends for them to be enjoyed by all people. And it's not yours to take everything and hoard it to yourself and then to tell other people, tough luck, this is mine, when that person has no food. That's to be selfish. That's going too far. So is there anything wrong with being rich? No, of course not. If you're self-controlled and smart and diligent in your work, you're likely going to become rich, because that's what makes people rich, right? That's what it means to be responsible and hardworking and productive. So that's natural for virtuous people to become wealthy. That's normal, right? But sometimes virtuous people are not wealthy, and they depend on the kindness of others, and God causes that to happen. He causes it for both the poor people to humble them and teach them to pray and be dependent, and he does it to the rich to challenge them to be generous so they can earn treasure in heaven for their generosity. So this fable teaches us that we should never seek comfort at other people's expense. It teaches us also that if you learn about other people's needs, you should not ignore their needs, and realize that you have a responsibility as a human being to think about the needs of other people and help them if you can, before you seek to make yourself richer and more comfortable and live luxuriously, right? That dog, he should have first asked himself the big question, which is, what is the master's will? What is the master's will for this hay? That should have been the dog's first question. And when he realized the master's will is for this hay to be eaten by this ox, he should have gotten out of there. So that would have solved the problem. And if he wasn't religious and he didn't think like that, he didn't think about the master's will, then he should have at least thought, is it right for me to lay down in this bed when this hay is this ox's food and he has nothing else to eat? No, the dog shouldn't have thought, hey, I was here first, tough luck. The dog should have realized that this ox needs this hay for his food to live, and he should have given it up and shared it with the ox. So we can see that this fable here teaches us about what it means to be rich and generous versus what it means to be rich and selfish. This dog is an example of a selfish, wealthy person, right? And this ox is an example of a simple, poor person. Let me ask you this. What kind of an animal is an ox? We'll finish up in a minute. What kind of an animal is an ox? What do oxen do? What do they do? Why does the farmer even have an ox? Does he just think it's cool? It's a work animal, right? The ox is a working animal. The ox doesn't come in the house. If it's cold out, there's no heating in the barn. The ox sleeps out in the cold. He sleeps out in the field. He eats grass. He drinks water. They're work animals. So the ox is a symbol of like the working class, humble, poor people who are dependent on others to feed them. The dog, where does the dog live? The dog usually lives in the house. On a cold night, the dog's laying next to the fireplace. The dog's eating the food that comes from the master's table. Dogs have a very comfortable life. The dogs are sort of a symbol of rich people in the fable. The ox is a symbol of a working, humble, poorer person who doesn't have any of those good things. All he gets is some hay and some water every day. That's all he gets. And the dog is going to take even that from him and try to make it his own, which is a symbol of that greedy, selfish, rich spirit. Okay, so does this fable teach us that being rich is bad? Yes or no? Does this fable teach us that being rich is bad? No. It teaches us that what is bad? What does it teach us is bad in this fable? Greed. Very good. Okay. Another name for greed in religious talk is avarice, right? Avarice is a fancier name for greed, that desire to have more than you need, especially when there are people around you who don't even have what they do need. Okay. So there, we could keep going and going and going and get more into more details of this fable because it just keeps going and going, right? We can say, like, did the ox earn his food? Did the ox earn the grass in the manger? And we can say, yes, the grass wouldn't even exist without the ox. The ox likely pulled the cart that carried the grass back to the barn. So we can get into more and more details and we can keep going. And that's why I said this is a short little fable, but it's very, very rich in terms of the moral lessons that it teaches us. So remember, the moral is you cannot seek comfort at other people's expense. That's when you know you're wrong. You know you're wrong when you're seeking comfort and making decisions that cause other people to not even have what they need. Okay? So you are not allowed to seek comfort at other people's expense. And that's what the dog was doing here. So that's the first thing. Understand the different characters of the dog and the ox. Think about the difference of the lives that they live. Think about the farmer and what his will is in this situation. And then you can think of other applications. Now, when you talk about the application to your life, I'd like you to try to think about your specific life, right? Don't just say something like, oh, rich people should. No, I'm not talking about rich people. I'm not talking about other people. When we talk about the application, we're talking about ourselves. So the question is, how can I apply this fable to my life, right? So for you as a kid, you probably don't have much riches, but sometimes you do. Sometimes you do have lots of stuff. Sometimes you have more than a friend, or you have more than another kid at church or something like that. So there are times where even as a kid, you may be like this dog and kind of hoarding things for yourself when there are other kids who could use some of the things that you have, and you have the opportunity to share. So there are ways for you to apply this to yourself personally at every point of your life as you grow up, when you're a kid and when you're an older man and so on. So think about that when you come up with the application. We're out of time here. I hope that's helpful. If you want to ask any questions about this fable, we can stay and chat for a few minutes. But otherwise, if you have no questions, you're free to go. So thanks for coming. I hope that's helpful. And we'll talk more about Aesop next Monday. Okay. God bless everybody. Take care.